The fire took her husband, but it didn't take her fear. When Chelsea McMillan watched the barn burn with Kell Goodwin trapped inside, she felt something that made her hate herself for years afterward. Relief. The whole town mourned him. They called him a fine man, a respectable husband. They had no idea that for 6 years he had beaten her behind closed doors, told her she was worthless, made her afraid to breathe too loud. She was 16 when she married him, an orphan with no choice. The town called her lucky. Nobody asked what she wanted. Nobody saw the bruises. After he died, Chelsea swore she would never let another man touch her heart. She built walls so high and so thick that nothing could get through. Then a quiet cowboy showed up at her ranch. A man who spoke to angry animals like they were something precious. A man whose gentleness terrified her more than any fist ever had. Because the last time someone was kind to her, it was just the mask before the monster. This story proves that surviving is not the same as healing, and that the right love doesn't break down your walls. It waits patiently while you take them down yourself. If you've ever been afraid to trust again after someone broke you, this story will reach into your chest and put something back together. Drop a comment and tell me, have you ever found gentleness where you least expected it? Subscribe now and stay until the very end. Chelsea's journey from survivor to truly living will change how you see love forever. The fire in the barn had taken her husband, but it had not taken her fear. That stayed with Chelsea McMillan like a shadow she could never outrun. Folks in Redemption Valley liked to say the creek sang sweet, but Chelsea knew better. Sweet sounds did not mean safe waters. She had learned that the hard way. Chelsea stood at the edge of her south pasture on a morning that smelled like dust and wildflowers. The sun was climbing over the mountains, painting everything gold. Her cattle moved slow across the grass, their bodies dark against the bright land. She counted them one by one. 43 head. All healthy. All hers. She was 28 years old, a widow, a rancher. A woman who had survived things most people could not imagine. And she was finally starting to feel something she had not felt in years. Control. But control had come at a terrible price. Chelsea pulled her hat lower against the sun and let her mind drift back to the day her life had changed forever. She was 16 years old when her father died. He fell from a horse during a storm and broke his neck. Her mother followed him 6 months later, taken by a fever that swept through the valley like a curse. Just like that, Chelsea was alone, an orphan with a ranch she did not know how to run and debts she could not pay. That was when Kell Goodwin appeared. Kell was the son of the richest banker in Redemption Valley. He had polished boots and a smile that made older women swoon. When he told Chelsea he wanted to marry her, the whole town celebrated. They called her lucky. They said she had been blessed. A handsome young man from a wealthy family wanted to save the poor orphan girl. Nobody asked Chelsea what she wanted. Nobody saw what happened behind closed doors. Kell Goodwin was a monster wrapped in expensive clothes. He controlled everything Chelsea did, what she wore, what she ate, who she talked to. When she spoke too loud, he punished her. When she cried, he punished her harder. He told her she was worthless, stupid, ugly. He said no one would ever love her. He said she should be grateful he had lowered himself to marry a nobody like her. For 6 years, Chelsea believed him. She learned to make herself small, to walk quiet, to keep her eyes down and her mouth shut. She forgot what it felt like to laugh. She forgot what it felt like to hope. She became a ghost living in her own body, waiting for the next blow to fall. Then one night, the barn caught fire. Chelsea remembered standing in the yard, watching the flames climb into the sky. She remembered the heat on her face, the screaming of the horses, the chaos of ranch hands running with buckets of water that did nothing against the inferno. Kell ran into the barn to save his favorite stallion. He never came out. The town mourned him. They said what a tragedy it was. What a loss. Such a fine young man taken too soon. Chelsea stood at his funeral in a black dress, her face empty, her heart beating with something she was afraid to name. Relief. She felt relief that her husband was dead, and she hated herself for it. The months after the fire were the hardest of her life. The ranch was in ruins. The debts were crushing. Suitors came sniffing around like wolves, offering to marry her and take over her problems. What they really wanted was her land. The Double M Ranch sat on some of the best grazing territory in the whole valley. Everyone knew it was worth a fortune. But Chelsea had learned something in those 6 years of hell with Kel Goodwin. She had learned that men who wanted to save you usually wanted to own you instead. So she said no. Again and again she said no. She sold off pieces of her jewelry. She worked 18-hour days. She learned to rope and brand and fix fences. She hired hands and fired the ones who did not respect her. She nearly broke herself a dozen times, but she did not let anyone take what was hers. Now, 3 years later, the Double M was thriving. The herd was healthy, the buildings were repaired, the debts were paid. Chelsea had done it all herself, and she had sworn she would never trust another man as long as she lived. That was the promise she made to herself every morning when she looked in the mirror. No man would ever control her again. No man would ever make her feel small. No man would ever touch her heart. She had built walls around herself so high and so thick that nothing could get through. Or so she thought. Chelsea finished counting the cattle and turned to walk back toward the main house. The morning was warming up fast. She could hear the chickens clucking near the coop and the distant sound of hammering from the bunkhouse. Her ranch hands were already at work. She had 7 men working for her now. Most of them had been with her for over a year. They knew better than to question her orders or try to sweet-talk her. She paid fair wages and expected hard work. Anyone who had a problem with taking orders from a woman could find employment elsewhere. There was only one hand she did not know well yet. A quiet man named Dalton Hancock, who had showed up about 3 months ago looking for work. He was different from the others. He did not talk much. He did not swagger around trying to impress anyone. He just worked. Morning to night he worked. And he was good at everything he touched. Chelsea had barely spoken to him beyond giving orders. She made a point of keeping distance between herself and her employees. It was safer that way. Cleaner, no complications, no misunderstandings. But lately she had started noticing things about Dalton Hancock that made her uncomfortable. The way he was patient with the difficult animals. The way he helped the younger hands without making them feel stupid. The way he never raised his voice, even when things went wrong. The way he looked at her sometimes, like he saw something in her that she had forgotten existed. She did not like it. She did not like the way her heart beat faster when he was nearby. She did not like the way she found herself looking for him across the fields. She did not like the warmth that spread through her chest when he tipped his hat and said good morning in that slow, steady voice of his. It felt dangerous. It felt like a crack forming in her walls, and Chelsea could not afford any cracks. She was almost to the main house when she heard something that made her stop. A soft voice coming from the dairy barn, calm and gentle, like someone singing a lullaby. "Easy there, girl. Nobody is rushing you. We have got all the time in the world." Chelsea moved closer, her boots silent on the packed dirt. She peered through the open barn door and saw something that made her breath catch in her throat. Dalton Hancock was standing next to old Bessie, the meanest dairy cow in 3 counties. Bessie had sent 3 different ranch hands to the doctor with bruised ribs and broken fingers. She kicked, she bit, she threw her weight around like she was trying to kill someone. Most of the hands refused to go near her. But there was Dalton, standing right beside her, one hand resting gently on her flank. He was talking to her in that quiet voice, steady as a heartbeat, and Bessie was calm. Her big brown eyes were soft. Her tail swished lazily at flies. She stood perfectly still while Dalton moved around her. Chelsea watched him work, watched the way his hands moved, slow and careful, never rushing, never forcing. He touched that angry cow like she was something precious, something worth being patient with. And Chelsea felt something shift inside her chest, something old and buried and dangerous, something she had promised herself she would never feel again. She turned away before Dalton could see her. She walked fast toward the house, her heart pounding, her hands shaking. No, she told herself. No, this was not happening. She was not going to let some quiet cowboy make her forget everything she had learned. She was not going to let kindness fool her again. Kel had been kind, too, at first. Before the wedding, before the doors closed, before the mask came off. All men wore masks. All men wanted something. And Chelsea McMillan was never going to let herself be fooled again. She pushed through the front door of her house and stood in the quiet kitchen, breathing hard. Through the window, she could see the dairy barn. She could see Dalton walking out with a bucket of milk, his face calm, his movements unhurried. He glanced toward the house. Their eyes met through the glass. Chelsea looked away first. But that night, lying alone in her bed, staring at the shadows on the ceiling, she could not stop thinking about the way he had touched that cow, the way he had spoken to her, the patience in his hands, the gentleness in his voice. She had never known a man could be gentle, not truly, not without wanting something in return. Maybe Dalton Hancock was different. Maybe he was exactly what he seemed to be, a good man with a quiet heart and steady hands. Or maybe he was just better at hiding his mask than the others. Chelsea closed her eyes and pulled the blanket tight around her shoulders. She would not let herself find out. She would keep her distance. She would maintain her walls. She would protect herself the way she had always protected herself. Because the last time she trusted a man, she almost did not survive. And Chelsea McMillan was not going to make that mistake again. 2 weeks passed. Chelsea kept her promise to herself. She stayed away from Dalton Hancock as much as she could. She gave him orders through her foreman. She avoided the dairy barn during milking hours. She ate her meals alone in the main house instead of joining the hands at the bunkhouse like she sometimes did in the past. But distance did not help. If anything, it made things worse. The less she saw Dalton, the more she thought about him. She found herself watching from windows, listening for his voice across the yard, noticing when he walked past. It was like trying not to think about a splinter stuck in your finger. The more you ignored it, the more it hurt. One afternoon, Chelsea was walking past the bunkhouse when she smelled something that stopped her in her tracks. It was rich and warm, meat and herbs and something sweet like honey. Her stomach growled before she could stop it. She had not eaten since breakfast. It was nearly 4 in the afternoon. The smell was coming from the bunkhouse kitchen. The door was propped open to let the heat escape. Chelsea moved closer without meaning to. She told herself she was just curious about what the hands were eating. She told herself it had nothing to do with who might be cooking. She peered through the door and saw Dalton standing at the stove. He had an apron tied around his waist. His sleeves were rolled up to his elbows. He was stirring something in a big iron pot, tasting it from a wooden spoon, adding pinches of herbs from little jars lined up on the counter. He cooked like he did everything else, calm, patient, careful. Chelsea watched him for a long moment before she realized what she was doing. She stepped back from the door, her face burning with embarrassment. What was wrong with her? She was acting like a lovesick schoolgirl instead of a grown woman who ran her own ranch. She turned to leave, but her boot scraped against a stone. The sound was small, but loud enough. Dalton looked up from his pot. "Mrs. Goodwin," he said. His voice was warm but not surprised, like he had known she was there the whole time. "Can I help you with something?" Chelsea felt her cheeks flush. She was not used to being caught off guard. She was not used to feeling flustered. "No," she said. Her voice came out too sharp. "I was just passing by." Dalton nodded. He did not seem offended. He just went back to stirring his pot. "Supper will be ready in about an hour," he said. "You're welcome to join us if you like. Made enough for everyone and then some." Chelsea should have said no. She should have turned and walked away. But her feet would not move. And her mouth, traitor that it was, said something she did not expect. "What are you making?" Dalton looked up again. A small smile crossed his face. It was not smug or teasing. It was just warm, like sunlight breaking through clouds. "Beef stew," he said, "my grandmother's recipe. She always said the secret was patience. You cannot rush good food. You have to let it simmer until all the flavors come together. Your grandmother taught you to cook." Dalton nodded. She raised me after my parents died, taught me everything I know, said a man who could not feed himself was not much use to anyone. Chelsea felt something loosen in her chest. She did not know why. Maybe it was the way he talked about his grandmother, the softness in his voice, the respect. "She sounds like a wise woman," Chelsea said. "She was." Dalton stirred the pot again. "Toughest woman I ever knew. Survived 3 husbands, 2 droughts, and a tornado that took her house. Rebuilt everything from nothing. Never complained once." Chelsea stared at him. That story hit close to home, closer than he could possibly know. "She died a few years back," Dalton continued. "Left me her recipe book and her cast-iron skillet. Said those were the only things worth inheriting." Chelsea found herself moving closer to the door. She did not step inside, but she leaned against the frame, watching him work. "Is that why you became a ranch hand?" she asked. "Because of her." "Partly." Dalton tasted the stew again and added a pinch of salt. "Partly because I needed somewhere to go after things fell apart." "What things?" Dalton was quiet for a moment. Chelsea expected him to change the subject. Men did not usually talk about their failures. They bragged about their successes and buried everything else. But Dalton just kept stirring. "I was engaged once," he said. "Thought we would build a life together, a little ranch, some cattle, maybe some kids running around." He shrugged. "Turned out she wanted different things, bigger things, fancier things, things I could not give her." Chelsea felt a strange pang in her chest. She did not know if it was sympathy or jealousy. Maybe both. What happened? "She found a man who could give her those things." Dalton's voice was steady. No bitterness, no anger, just acceptance. "Cannot blame her for wanting what she wanted. I just was not enough." Chelsea stared at him. She knew that feeling. The feeling of not being enough. Kel had told her that every single day. "You are not smart enough. You are not pretty enough. You are not worth the food I put on the table." But hearing Dalton say it about himself felt wrong. He was clearly a good man, a capable man. Any woman would be lucky to have him. "She found a man who could give her those things." The words echoed in Chelsea's head. A man who could give her those things. As if a woman's love could be bought with money and fancy gifts. As if the size of a man's wallet mattered more than the size of his heart. "She sounds like a fool," Chelsea said. Dalton looked up at her. Surprise flickered across his face. Then something else. Something that looked almost like hope. "That is kind of you to say," he said softly. Chelsea pushed away from the doorframe. She had already said too much. Revealed too much. Let her walls slip too far. "I should go," she said. "Lots of work to do." Dalton nodded. "The offer stands." "About supper?" "No pressure. But you are always welcome." Chelsea walked away without answering. But that night, for the first time in months, she did not eat alone. She told herself it was because she was tired of her own cooking. She told herself it was because the hands needed to see their boss sometimes. She told herself it had nothing to do with the quiet man who served her stew with a gentle smile. But deep down, she knew she was lying to herself. After supper, Chelsea walked back toward the main house. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. She was almost home when something caught her eye. A small garden behind the bunkhouse. Neat rows of green plants growing in careful lines. She had never noticed it before. Chelsea walked closer. The garden was beautiful. Tomatoes, beans, peppers, herbs of every kind. Everything was healthy and thriving, tended with obvious care. Little wooden stakes marked each row. The soil was dark and rich. It reminded her of something. A memory she had buried so deep she had almost forgotten it existed. Her mother's garden. When Chelsea was a little girl, her mother had kept a garden just like this one. She would spend hours out there, humming to herself, her hands in the dirt. Chelsea would sit beside her, watching, learning, asking questions about every plant. After her mother died, Chelsea had let the garden go. She could not bear to look at it, Every time she saw those empty beds, she thought about her mother's hands, her mother's voice, her mother's love. The garden had been dead for 10 years now, nothing but weeds and memories. But here was a new garden, growing right on her own land, tended by hands she did not recognize. "Can I help you?" Chelsea jumped. Dalton was standing a few feet away, a watering can in his hand. He looked uncertain, maybe even nervous. "I did not mean to startle you," he said. "I was just coming to water the plants before dark." Chelsea looked from him to the garden and back again. "You made this?" she asked. Dalton nodded. "Hope that is okay. I asked your foreman if I could use this patch of ground. He said it was just sitting empty. I can tear it out if you want. If it is in the way." "No." The word came out fast. Too fast. Chelsea took a breath. "No, it is fine. It is nice. I just did not know it was here." Dalton set down the watering can. "Been working on it since I got here. Growing food is good for the soul, my grandmother used to say. Keeps you humble, keeps you patient." Chelsea stared at the neat rows of plants. She felt tears prick her eyes and blink them away. "My mother used to say the same thing," she said quietly. Dalton did not respond. He just stood there, comfortable in the silence, giving her space. Chelsea reached down and touched one of the tomato plants. The leaves were soft under her fingers. Alive. Growing. "Could I see it?" she asked. "The garden, I mean. Would you show me?" Dalton's face lit up. Not with pride or smugness, just with genuine happiness, like she had given him a gift. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "Of course." He walked her through the rows, naming each plant, explaining how he cared for them, what they needed to thrive. His voice was soft and steady. His hands moved with gentleness as he touched the leaves and stems. Chelsea listened, but mostly, she watched. She watched the way he loved these growing things, the patience he gave them, the care. And she felt something crack inside her chest, one of her walls crumbling a little at the edges. It scared her more than anything had scared her in years. But for the first time since Kell died, Chelsea did not run away from the fear. She stayed. After that evening in the garden, Chelsea could not pretend anymore. She could not pretend she did not notice Dalton. She could not pretend she did not care about him. She could not pretend her walls were as strong as they used to be. She tried. Lord knows she tried. But every morning she found herself looking for him across the fields. Every evening she found herself listening for his voice. And every night, lying alone in her bed, she found herself thinking about the way he smiled when he talked about tomatoes. She was falling for him, slowly, terribly, inevitably, and it scared her more than the fire that had taken Kell, more than the years of abuse, more than anything she had ever faced. Because trusting someone meant giving them power over you. And the last time Chelsea had given someone power over her, she had almost lost herself completely. One afternoon, about a month after the garden conversation, Chelsea was in the barn reviewing the herd counts with her foreman. They were discussing which cattle to sell at the fall auction when the sound of boots on gravel made them both turn. A man stood in the barn entrance. He was tall and well-dressed, with a neat beard and cold eyes. Dr. Rocky Ferguson, the most respected physician in Redemption Valley, and one of the men Chelsea disliked most in the whole world. Ferguson had been one of Kell's friends. He had come to dinner at the Goodwin house many times. He had seen the bruises on Chelsea's arms and the fear in her eyes. And he had never said a word, never asked if she was okay, never offered to help. After Kell died, Ferguson had tried to court Chelsea. He brought flowers and sweet words and promises of a comfortable life. Chelsea had turned him down flat. The look in his eyes when she rejected him told her everything she needed to know about his true character. "Chelsea," Ferguson said now. His voice was smooth as oil. "I need a moment alone with you." Chelsea folded her arms. "I am discussing ranch business with my foreman. Whatever you have to say can be said here." Ferguson's smile thinned. "Very well." He stepped closer, his polished boots clicking on the wooden floor. "I've heard troubling rumors. People are saying your companionship with a hired hand is becoming improper. Chelsea felt heat rise in her cheeks. Not from embarrassment, from anger. My companionship is no one's business but mine, she said. Ferguson clicked his tongue like a disappointed schoolteacher. Now, Chelsea, you know how quickly a woman's reputation can sour. You are a widow of standing. You have a certain position in this community. Spending time with a common cowboy threatens all of that. Chelsea heard footsteps behind her. Dalton had come into the barn without her noticing. He stood a few feet away, his face calm but his eyes sharp. Ferguson noticed him, too. His lip curled with disdain. Speaking of which, he said, here is the man himself. Tell me, Mr. Hancock, do you not think it improper to be spending so much time with your employer? A vulnerable widow. Dalton did not flinch. I spend time with the cattle too, he said. Nobody seems to find that improper. Chelsea almost laughed, but she bit it back. This was not a moment for humor. Ferguson's face reddened. You think you are clever? Let me be clear. A man of your station has no business associating with a woman like Mrs. Goodwin. You are a hired hand, nothing more. Remember your place. Something cold and hard settled in Chelsea's chest. She had heard men talk like this her whole life. Men who thought they could decide who was worthy and who was not. Men who thought their money and their titles gave them the right to control everyone around them. She stepped forward. Her voice was quiet but sharp as a blade. He is a decent man, she said. Something you might try being one day. Ferguson blinked. His mouth opened and closed like a fish. Chelsea continued. You came into my barn uninvited. You insulted my employee. You presumed to lecture me about my own life. I believe it is time for you to leave. Ferguson's face twisted. You are making a mistake, Chelsea. People are watching. People are talking. If you continue down this path, you will find yourself alone and ruined. Dalton stepped closer. His voice was low and steady. I think the lady asked you to leave, he said. Ferguson turned on him. His eyes were full of spite. And I think you should remember your place. You are nothing. A vagrant with dirt under his fingernails. Do not forget who you are talking to. Dalton did not back down. His shoulders stayed straight. His hands stayed loose at his sides. He looked like a man who had faced down worse than a puffed-up doctor with too much pride. Men like me work for what we have, Dalton said. We do not expect anything handed to us. We do not look down on people because of their jobs or their clothes or the size of their house. He paused. Maybe you could learn something from that. Ferguson's face went purple. He looked from Dalton to Chelsea and back again. His mouth worked, but no words came out. Finally, he turned and stormed out of the barn. His boot struck the ground so hard that dust puffed up with every step. The barn was quiet. Chelsea realized her hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against her skirt to steady them. I'm sorry you had to hear that, she said to Dalton. Dalton shook his head. I am not sorry. He paused. I just do not want my presence to make your life harder. Chelsea looked at him, really looked at him, at the steadiness in his eyes, the strength in his jaw, the quiet dignity in his bearing. Do you care? She asked. Her voice came out softer than she intended. What people think. Dalton met her gaze. His answer was simple and direct. I care that it might hurt you. But I do not care one bit what anyone thinks about me being near you. Chelsea had no reply, not one she trusted herself to say out loud. But something shifted between them after that. A line that had been there since the beginning suddenly seemed thinner, more fragile, easier to cross. Over the next few weeks, they stopped pretending there was nothing between them. They ate meals together. They walked the pastures together. They talked about everything and nothing, their conversations stretching late into the evening while the stars came out one by one. Chelsea learned that Dalton had grown up in Nebraska, that he had worked ranches across 3 states, that he could play the harmonica badly but with enthusiasm, that he liked to read poetry when no one was watching. Dalton learned that Chelsea loved thunderstorms, that she had named all her chickens after flowers, that she secretly kept a journal where she wrote down her dreams, that she had once wanted to be a school teacher before life had other plans. They shared pieces of themselves, small pieces at first, then bigger ones. And with each piece, Chelsea felt her walls crumbling a little more. It terrified her, but she could not stop. Then Zane Banks came. He arrived on a Tuesday afternoon riding a horse that probably cost more than most people's houses. He had dark hair slicked back with expensive oil, and a suit that looked ridiculous on a working ranch. His smile was too wide and too white. His eyes were too cold. Chelsea knew him by reputation. Banks owned the biggest leather business in the valley. He had made his fortune buying up land from desperate farmers and ranchers, paying pennies on the dollar, then flipping the properties for huge profits. He was exactly the kind of man Chelsea despised. Banks walked into her kitchen without knocking, without asking permission. Like he already owned the place. "Chelsea, darling," he said, "I believe it is time we discussed our future." Dalton was there too. He had been helping Chelsea sort through some paperwork. He stood up when Banks came in, positioning himself between the newcomer and Chelsea. "Mr. Banks," Chelsea said. Her voice was ice. "I do not recall inviting you in." Banks ignored her. He pulled out a chair and sat down without being asked. Made himself comfortable, like this was his house instead of hers. "I am prepared to offer you a very generous deal," he said. "Complete financial support, social respectability, modernization of your ranch. In return, you will provide land access for my growing leather business." Chelsea felt her stomach turn. He was not proposing marriage. He was proposing a business transaction, and he clearly expected her to accept. "And if I decline?" she asked. Banks leaned back in his chair. His smile never wavered, but his eyes went flat and cold. "Do not be foolish," he said. "The alternative is social ruin. This little affection you have for your cowboy is already causing talk. You need a respectable husband." He spread his hands. "I am your last decent option." Chelsea felt something inside her snap. Not break, not crumble, snap, like a rope pulled too tight. She stepped toward him. Her voice was quiet but hard as iron. "My last decent option," she repeated. "Let me tell you something about decent men, Mr. Banks. Decent men treat their families with kindness. Decent men work hard. Decent men honor their word." She paused. "You do not know the meaning of decent." Banks's smile disappeared. His face twisted into something ugly. "You are making a mistake," he said. "A mistake that will ruin you." Chelsea moved to stand beside Dalton, side by side, shoulder to shoulder. "My mistake," she said, "was forgetting that I deserve better than men who think I am something to buy." Banks looked from Chelsea to Dalton. His eyes were full of hatred. "Men like him do not stay," he said. "Men like him take what they want and move on." He sneered. "Do not come crying to me when he breaks your heart." Dalton finally spoke. His voice was calm but firm. "I am standing right here," he said, "and you do not speak for me." Banks stormed out. He slammed the door so hard that the jars on the shelf rattled. The kitchen went quiet. Chelsea exhaled slowly. She felt exhausted, wrung out, like she had just fought a battle. "That was exhausting," she said. Dalton stepped closer, not touching her, but close enough that she could feel his warmth. "You handled him just fine," he said. "Did I?" Dalton's eyes met hers. "You made your choice clear." Chelsea looked at him. Her pulse quickened, her breath caught. "And what choice was that?" she whispered. Dalton hesitated. Then he spoke in a voice so soft she almost did not hear it. "The choice to keep me in your life." Chelsea could not deny it. She did not want to deny it. She was choosing Dalton over society, over safety, over everything she had promised herself she would never do again, and it scared her to death. But for the first time in her life, the fear felt less important than what she might gain if she was brave enough to try. The night after Banks stormed out, Chelsea could not sleep. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing, her heart pounding. She had made her choice clear to the whole world. She had stood beside Dalton and told the richest man in the valley to go to hell. There was no going back now. The rumors would spread. The gossip would grow. By morning, everyone in Redemption Valley would know that the widow McMillan had chosen a common ranch hand over a wealthy businessman. Chelsea told herself she did not care. She had spent her whole life caring what other people thought. She was tired of it, exhausted by it. What had it ever gotten her except pain and loneliness? But still, doubt gnawed at her. What if Banks was right? What if Dalton was just using her? What if this was all some elaborate game and she was the fool who could not see the truth? She had been fooled before. She had believed Kell when he promised to love and protect her. She had believed the town when they said she was lucky. She had believed so many lies that she no longer trusted herself to recognize the truth. Around midnight, Chelsea gave up on sleep. She pulled on a robe and walked downstairs to the kitchen. Maybe some warm milk would help. Maybe the quiet darkness would calm her racing thoughts. But when she reached the kitchen, she saw a light flickering outside. A lantern, glowing in the yard behind the bunkhouse. Near the garden, Chelsea moved to the window. She could see a figure moving among the plants, Dalton. He was out there in the middle of the night, tending his garden. Without thinking, she grabbed a shawl and stepped outside. The night air was cool. Stars scattered across the sky like spilled sugar. The moon hung low and bright, casting silver shadows across the land. Chelsea walked through the quiet darkness until she reached the garden. Dalton looked up when he heard her footsteps. He did not seem surprised, just glad. Could not sleep, he said. It was not a question. Chelsea shook her head. Me neither. Dalton set down his lantern. The light flickered between them, warm and golden. Want to talk about it, he asked. Chelsea wrapped the shawl tighter around her shoulders. She did not know where to start. There was so much she wanted to say, so much she was afraid to say. Can I ask you something? She said finally. Dalton nodded. Anything. Chelsea took a breath. Why are you still here? Dalton tilted his head. What do you mean? I mean you could work anywhere. You are good at what you do. People would line up to hire you. Chelsea paused. But you stay here, even with all the trouble. Even with men like Ferguson and Banks making your life harder. Why? Dalton was quiet for a long moment. He looked up at the stars, then back at her. You know why, he said softly. Chelsea's heart beat faster. Tell me anyway. Dalton stepped closer. The lantern light caught his eyes, making them glow like amber. The first time I saw you, he said, you were yelling at a cattle buyer who was trying to cheat you. You were standing in the middle of the yard, covered in dust with hay in your hair, and you were telling this man twice your size that you would not be taken for a fool. Chelsea remembered that day. The buyer had tried to lowball her on a herd sale. She had nearly chased him off the property with a pitchfork. I thought, Dalton continued, there goes the strongest woman I have ever seen. Not just tough, not just stubborn, strong. The kind of strong that comes from surviving things that would break most people. Chelsea felt tears prick her eyes. She blinked them away. You do not know what I survived, she whispered. No, Dalton agreed. But I know pain when I see it, and I know strength when I see it too. He paused. I stayed because I wanted to be near that strength. I stayed because being here near you makes me want to be a better man. Chelsea's throat was tight. Nobody had ever said anything like that to her. Nobody had ever seen her strength instead of her weakness, her scars instead of her failures. I was married before, she said. The words came out before she could stop them. To a man who hurt me. Dalton went very still. His eyes searched her face. Kell Goodwin, he said quietly. I heard rumors. Chelsea nodded. She felt exposed, vulnerable, like she was standing naked in the moonlight. He was cruel, she said, in ways I cannot even describe. For 6 years, I lived in fear. Every day I wondered if that would be the day he finally went too far. She paused. When he died in that fire, I felt relief. And then I hated myself for feeling that relief. Because what kind of woman is glad her husband is dead? Dalton reached out, slowly, carefully. He took her hand in his. His palm was warm and rough and steady. The kind of woman who survived, he said. The kind of woman who refused to let him break her. The kind of woman who deserves every moment of peace she can find. Chelsea stared at their joined hands. His grip was gentle. He was not holding her tight. He was just holding her, like he wanted to be there but would let go the moment she asked. That was the difference. That was everything. I am scared, she admitted, of trusting anyone again, of letting someone in, of being wrong. Dalton nodded. I understand. How can you understand? Because I am scared too. He smiled faintly. Scared you will realize I am not good enough. Scared you will wake up one day and decide I am not worth the trouble. Scared I will lose the only woman I have ever really wanted. Chelsea felt something break inside her. Not a bad break. A good one. Like ice cracking on a river in spring. Like light flooding into a dark room. You want me? She said. Not a question. A statement. Dalton's hand tightened on hers. Just slightly. Since the first day I saw you, he said. Since before I even knew your name. Chelsea looked at him in the lantern light. This quiet, patient, gentle man who had never asked anything of her, who had never pushed or demanded or tried to control, who had simply been there, steady and true, waiting for her to be ready. Maybe she was ready. Maybe she had been ready for longer than she realized. Dalton, she said. Her voice was barely a whisper. I think I am falling for you too. His breath caught. His whole body went still. You do not have to say that, he said. Just because I did. I am not saying it because you did. Chelsea stepped closer. I am saying it because it is true. Because every time I see you, I feel something I thought I would never feel again. Because you make me believe that maybe, I deserve to be happy. Dalton's hand came up to cup her face. His touch was light, feather light, like she was something precious. May I kiss you? He asked. Chelsea answered by closing the distance between them. The kiss was soft, tender, a question and an answer all at once. It tasted like starlight and promises, like the end of loneliness, like the beginning of something new. When they finally pulled apart, Chelsea was trembling. Not from cold, not from fear, from something else entirely. We do not have to rush anything, Dalton murmured. I will move at your pace, whatever you need, however long it takes. Chelsea leaned her forehead against his. I know, she said. That is why I trust you. They stood there for a long time, holding each other in the garden, surrounded by growing things and moonlight and the first fragile shoots of love. And for the first time in more years than she could count, Chelsea felt safe. The next few weeks were the happiest Chelsea had known since childhood. She and Dalton spent every spare moment together, walking the pastures at dawn, sharing meals at sunset, talking for hours about everything and nothing. They moved slowly, carefully, like two people who had been hurt before and knew how easily things could break. But underneath the caution was something stronger, something that grew every day. A foundation being built brick by brick, touch by touch, word by word. The ranch hands noticed the change. They smiled and looked away. They gave Chelsea and Dalton space. They seemed genuinely happy that their boss had found someone who made her laugh. Even the animals seemed to notice. Old Bessie stopped trying to kick anyone. The horses came to the fence when they saw Dalton coming. It was like the whole ranch had relaxed, like the land itself was breathing easier. But not everyone was happy. Dr. Ferguson and Zane Banks had not forgotten their humiliation. They were men who were not used to being told no. Men who believed their money and status entitled them to whatever they wanted. And they had been rejected by a woman they considered beneath them. That could not stand. The rumors started small. Whispers at church. Raised eyebrows at the general store. Little comments designed to plant seeds of doubt. "Did you hear about the widow McMillan and that drifter Cowboy? I heard he is after her money, just waiting for her to sign over the ranch. Such a shame. She used to be respectable." Chelsea pretended not to notice. She held her head high and looked people in the eye. But inside, each whisper cut like a knife. She had worked so hard to rebuild her reputation after Kell died. She had fought for every scrap of respect. And now, it was all being torn away because she had dared to choose her own happiness. One afternoon, Chelsea went into town to buy supplies. The general store was busy with women shopping and men loitering on the porch. When Chelsea walked in, the conversation stopped. Every head turned to look at her. She kept her face calm. She gathered her supplies. She waited in line like everyone else. But when she reached the counter, the store owner would not meet her eyes. "That will be $3.40, he muttered. Chelsea counted out the money. "Thank you." The owner glanced up at her. Then he leaned closer and lowered his voice. "Mrs. McMillan," he said, "some folks are saying things about you and that ranch hand." He shifted uncomfortably. "I know it is not my place, but I thought you should know. People are talking about organizing something." "Organizing something," Chelsea repeated. "What does that mean?" The owner looked away. "Just be careful. Some of the men in town think that a widow should not be running a ranch on her own. They think she should have a proper husband, someone respectable." He paused. "Someone they approve of." Chelsea felt ice form in her stomach. "Are you threatening me?" The owner held up his hands. "No, ma'am, I'm trying to warn you. Ferguson and Banks have been stirring people up. They are saying that ranch is too valuable to be in the hands of a woman who might give it away to some nobody." Chelsea grabbed her supplies and walked out without another word. She was shaking by the time she reached her wagon. Her hands trembled so badly she could barely untie the horses. All her life she had been treated like property. Something to be bought and sold and controlled. She had fought so hard for independence. And now these men wanted to take it away just because she had fallen in love with someone they considered beneath her. She drove home in a daze. The sky was gray and heavy, and a storm was coming. She could feel it in the air, in the tension building across the valley, in the whispers that followed her everywhere she went. When she got back to the ranch, Dalton was waiting for her. He took one look at her face and his expression darkened. "What happened?" he asked. Chelsea told him everything, the rumors, the warning, the threat that something was being organized against her. Dalton listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "I should go," he said finally. Chelsea's heart stopped. "What?" "If I leave, the rumors will die down. They will have nothing to talk about. You can get your reputation back." Dalton's voice was steady, but his eyes were full of pain. "I will not be the reason you lose everything you worked for." Chelsea stared at him. She felt like the ground was crumbling beneath her feet. "You would leave," she said, "just like that. Just walk away. If it protects you, yes." Chelsea felt anger rise in her chest, hot and fierce. "So all those things you said, about falling for me, about wanting to build something together, that was all just talk?" "No." Dalton stepped toward her. "It was all true, every word. But Chelsea, your ranch, your home, your life, I cannot ask you to risk all of that for me." "You are not asking," Chelsea snapped. "I am choosing." She grabbed his hands, held them tight. "Do you not understand? I spent 6 years being controlled by a man who decided everything for me. I will not let Ferguson and Banks decide for me either." Dalton searched her face. "What are you saying?" "I am saying that I choose you." Chelsea's voice shook, but she did not look away. "I am saying that whatever comes, we face it together. I am saying that if they want to come for my ranch, they will have to go through both of us." Dalton was quiet. Then slowly, carefully, he pulled her into his arms. "I do not deserve you," he murmured against her hair. Chelsea closed her eyes. "Yes, you do. We deserve each other. We deserve—" "And I am tired of pretending otherwise." They held each other as the first drops of rain began to fall. The storm was coming. The fight was coming. But for the first time in her life, Chelsea did not feel alone. She had someone standing beside her, and that made all the difference. The storm that night was one of the worst Redemption Valley had seen in years. Thunder shook the windows. Lightning split the sky. Rain pounded the roof like fists demanding entry. Chelsea and Dalton spent the night moving animals to safety, securing loose equipment, checking for damage. They worked side by side, shouting to be heard over the wind, their clothes soaked through. By dawn, the storm had passed. The ranch had survived mostly intact, a few fences down, some flooding in the lower pastures. Nothing that could not be fixed. But the real storm was just beginning. It started with a letter, delivered by a nervous young man on a tired horse. The letter was signed by 12 of the most prominent citizens of Redemption Valley, business owners, church elders, town council members. It demanded that Chelsea McMillan appear before an emergency meeting to discuss the future of the Double M Ranch. Chelsea read the letter 3 times. Her hands were steady, her face was calm, but inside, she was burning. "This is it," she said to Dalton. "They are making their move." Dalton read the letter over her shoulder. His jaw tightened. "They cannot legally take your ranch," he said. "It is your property, free and clear. No, but they can make my life impossible." Chelsea set the letter down. "They can refuse to do business with me. They can spread more rumors. They can isolate me until I have no choice but to sell." She looked at him. "That is how men like Ferguson and Banks operate. They do not use force. They use pressure. They squeeze until you break." Dalton's eyes flashed. "Then we do not break." Chelsea almost smiled. "We do not break." Not. The meeting was held 3 days later at the town hall. Chelsea dressed carefully. She wore her best dress, not to impress anyone, but to remind them that she was not some desperate widow they could push around. She was a businesswoman, a landowner, a citizen with rights. Dalton wanted to come with her. Chelsea told him no. "If you are there, they will make it about you," she said. "About us. They will say I cannot speak for myself, that I am just following my man." She shook her head. "I need to face them alone." Dalton did not like it, but he understood. "I will be right outside," he said, "if you need anything." Chelsea squeezed his hand. "I know." The town hall was packed. Every seat was taken. People stood along the walls and crowded the doorway. Everyone wanted to see what would happen to the widow who had dared to defy the natural order. Chelsea walked down the aisle with her head high. She felt the stares, heard the whispers. She ignored all of it. At the front of the room, a long table had been set up. Ferguson sat at the center looking smug. Banks sat beside him wearing that too-wide smile. The other men were local businessmen, people Chelsea had known her whole life, people who had stood by and watched while Kell hurt her, people who had called her lucky. "Mrs. Goodwin," Ferguson began, "thank you for joining us." "It is Mrs. McMillan," Chelsea corrected. "I took back my family name after my husband died." Ferguson's smile flickered. "Yes, of course." He shuffled some papers. "We have asked you here because we are concerned. The Double M Ranch is one of the most valuable properties in the valley, and there are worries that it is not being managed properly." "Not being managed properly," Chelsea repeated. "My herd has grown 30% in 3 years. I have paid off every debt. I have improved every building." She looked around the room. "What exactly is improper about that?" Banks leaned forward. "The concern is not about your business skills, Mrs. McMillan. It is about your personal choices, choices that reflect poorly on this community." Chelsea felt her anger rising. "You mean my choice to keep company with a man you consider beneath me?" The room murmured. Some people looked uncomfortable. Others nodded in agreement. A widow has certain responsibilities, Ferguson said, a certain image to maintain. When you associate with common laborers, when you reject respectable offers of marriage, when you behave in ways that cause talk, you damage not just yourself but the entire community. Chelsea stared at him. This man who had eaten dinner at her table while her husband beat her in the next room. This man who had never once asked if she was okay. This man who had the nerve to lecture her about responsibility. "Let me understand," she said. Her voice was calm but sharp as glass. "You are saying that I, a free citizen, am not allowed to choose who I spend my time with. You are saying that because I am a woman, I must accept whatever husband you approve of. You are saying that my worth depends not on my work or my character, but on whether you find my personal life acceptable." Ferguson frowned. "That is not what we meant, is it not?" Chelsea looked around the room. "I see 12 men at that table, not a single woman. I see you deciding my future without asking what I want, without considering what I have built, without respecting that I have a right to live my life as I choose." She stepped forward. "Let me tell you something about Kell Goodwin. You're a respectable businessman. You're a fine, upstanding citizen." She paused. "He beat me. For 6 years, he beat me. He told me I was worthless. He told me no one would ever love me. He made me afraid to speak, afraid to move, afraid to exist in my own home." The room went silent, dead silent. Chelsea continued. "And you all knew. Some of you saw the bruises. Some of you heard the whispers. But none of you did anything. Because Kell was respectable. Because Kell had money. Because it was easier to look away than to help a scared 16-year-old girl." Ferguson's face was pale. Banks looked like he wanted to sink through the floor. "So do not talk to me about respectability," Chelsea said. "Do not talk to me about community standards. The man you would have me marry again tried to buy me like cattle. The man you look down on has shown me more kindness in 3 months than my husband showed me in 6 years." She paused. "If that makes me improper, then I am proud to be improper." She looked at the table of men. Her voice dropped low. "Now, you can try to pressure me. You can spread your rumors. You can refuse to do business with me. But know this, I will not be bullied. I will not be broken. I survived Kell Goodwin. I can certainly survive you." She turned and walked out of the room. The crowd parted like water. She heard gasps, whispers. A few people even started clapping. Dalton was waiting outside. His face lit up when he saw her. "How did it go?" he asked. Chelsea smiled. A real smile. "The first one in days. I think I just told the most powerful men in the valley to go to hell." Dalton laughed. "That is my girl." He took her hand. They walked to the wagon together. Behind them, the town hall erupted in chaos, shouting, arguing, the sound of old certainties cracking apart. Chelsea did not look back. She had said what needed to be said. Now all that remained was to see what would happen next. The days after the town hall meeting were strange and uncertain. Chelsea expected attacks, retaliation, some kind of organized effort to destroy her. Instead, she got something unexpected. Support. It started with Sarah Thompson, the general store owner's wife. She showed up at the ranch 2 days after the meeting with a basket of fresh bread. "I heard what you said," Sarah told her, "about Kell, about the bruises." She shook her head. "I suspected back then. But I never said anything. I was too scared." She pressed the bread basket into Chelsea's hands. "I am so sorry. I should have done something." Chelsea did not know what to say. She stood in her doorway holding warm bread, feeling tears prick her eyes. "You were scared," she said finally. "We all were." Sarah nodded. "Well, I'm not scared anymore. And neither should you be." She smiled. "What you did at that meeting. Standing up like that. Speaking the truth." She paused. "It meant something to a lot of us." Over the next week, more women came. Martha Williams brought a ham. Clara Jenkins brought eggs. Nancy Baker brought a quilt she had made herself. They came one by one, sometimes in pairs, offering food and support and solidarity. Each one had a story. Each one had stayed silent for too long. Each one was ready to speak. "He used to hit me too," Nancy admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "Nobody believed me because he was so charming in public." "I was afraid to leave," Martha said. "I had children. Where would I go?" "My father arranged my marriage," Clara confessed. "I never wanted it. But what choice did I have?" Chelsea listened to each story. She held hands. She offered tea. She cried with women she had known her whole life but had never really known. She was not alone. She had never been alone. There were women all over the valley carrying the same wounds, hiding the same pain, wearing the same masks. And now, one by one, they were taking those masks off. Ferguson and Banks did not give up easily. They tried to call another meeting. They tried to pressure the bank into calling in loans Chelsea did not have. They tried to spread rumors that she had lost her mind. But the tide had turned. Men who had nodded along with their schemes started having second thoughts. Wives whispered to husbands about what Chelsea had said, about what they had seen, about secrets that had been kept too long. The coalition Ferguson had built started to crumble. Businessmen withdrew their support. Church elders suddenly remembered pressing engagements. Town council members developed convenient illnesses. Within a month, Ferguson and Banks found themselves isolated. The men who had once followed them now avoided eye contact. The women who had once smiled politely now turned away when they passed. "Karma," Dalton said one evening, watching the sunset from the porch. "It takes its time, but it always arrives." Chelsea leaned against him. "I never expected this." "What?" Chelsea gestured at the yard where 3 of the local women were visiting, their children playing together while they talked and laughed. "This," she said. "People actually standing with me. I thought I would have to fight alone forever." Dalton put his arm around her. "You were willing to fight alone. That is what made people want to stand with you." Chelsea thought about that. Maybe he was right. Maybe courage was contagious. Maybe all it took was one person brave enough to speak the truth for others to find their own voices. Or maybe, she thought, looking at the man beside her, she had just finally found something worth fighting for. One evening, about 6 weeks after the town hall meeting, Chelsea found Dalton in the garden. He was kneeling among the tomato plants, his hands in the dirt, a look of concentration on his face. She watched him for a moment before speaking. "What are you doing?" Dalton looked up. He had dirt smudged on his cheek. His smile was shy. "I have been thinking," he said, "about the future." Chelsea's heart beat faster. "What about it?" Dalton stood up. He brushed off his hands, took a deep breath. "This ranch," he said. "It is your life, your legacy, everything you have worked for." He paused. "But I keep thinking about what it could be, what we could build together. If you want that, if you would have me." Chelsea stared at him. "Are you asking me something?" Dalton's eyes met hers. He looked nervous, hopeful, scared. "I guess I am," he said. "I am asking if you would marry me, Chelsea McMillan. Not because you need protection, not because you need a man to run things, but because I love you. Because I want to spend the rest of my life making you happy. Because I cannot imagine a future that does not have you in it." Chelsea felt the world tilt. She had sworn she would never marry again. She had built walls so high that no one could climb them. She had promised herself she would never give another man power over her heart. But Dalton was not asking for power. He was offering partnership. He was not trying to take anything. He was offering everything. "Yes," she said. Dalton blinked. "Yes, yes, I will marry you." Chelsea stepped forward and took his face in her hands. His dirty, beautiful, honest face. "Because I love you too. Because you make me believe in things I thought I had lost forever." Dalton's smile could have lit up the whole valley. He picked her up and spun her around while she laughed. A real laugh, free and bright and full of joy. They were going to build a future together, and nothing was going to stop them. The wedding was simple. That was how Chelsea wanted it. No fancy dresses or elaborate ceremonies, no pretense or performance, just two people who loved each other, promising to spend their lives together. They held it on a crisp October morning. The leaves were turning gold and red. The sky was clear and endless. The mountains stood watch like old friends. About 30 people came. The ranch hands, the women who had shown up with food and support, a few townsfolk who had proven themselves friends, Sarah Thompson, Martha Williams, Clara Jenkins, women who had found their voices and decided to use them. Chelsea wore her mother's favorite shade of blue, a simple dress that matched the autumn sky. Dalton wore his best shirt, pressed and clean. His boots were polished for the first time since she had known him. They stood under an arch of wildflowers that the hands had built. Dalton had picked the flowers himself that morning. There was no minister. Chelsea had asked an old family friend, a retired judge, to officiate. She wanted someone who saw her as a person, not a piece of property to be transferred from one owner to another. The vows were their own words, not recited from a book, not repeated after someone else. Chelsea went first. "Dalton," she said, "I spent most of my life being afraid. Afraid of being hurt. Afraid of being controlled. Afraid of trusting anyone with my heart." She paused. "But you showed me that love does not have to hurt, that partnership does not mean surrender, that a man can be gentle without being weak." She took his hands. Her voice was steady. "I promise to stand beside you, not behind you. I promise to trust you with my heart, because you have earned that trust every single day since I met you. I promise to love you not because I need you, but because I choose you." Dalton's eyes were bright. He squeezed her hands. "Chelsea," he said, "the first time I saw you, you were yelling at a cattle buyer who was trying to cheat you." He smiled at the memory. "I thought you were the most magnificent woman I had ever seen. Fierce, strong, unbreakable." He paused. "But I also saw the pain you carried, the walls you had built, and I made myself a promise. I promised that if you ever let me in, I would spend the rest of my life making sure you never regretted it." He stepped closer. His voice dropped low. "I promise to love you because of your strength, not despite it. I promise to be your partner in everything. I promise to build something beautiful with you, brick by brick, day by day, for as long as we both live." The old judge smiled. "By the power vested in me by the great territory of Montana, I pronounce you husband and wife." He nodded at Dalton. "You may kiss your bride." The kiss was soft and sweet, full of promise. The small crowd cheered. The autumn wind carried their applause across the valley. That night, after the guests had gone and the ranch was quiet, Chelsea and Dalton stood on the porch watching the stars come out. "Are you happy?" Dalton asked. Chelsea leaned into him. "Happier than I have ever been." He put his arm around her. "Me too." They stood there for a long time, wrapped in each other and in the silence. The night was peaceful. The land was peaceful. Everything felt right. Later, in the warmth of their bedroom, Dalton held her gently, like she was something precious, like he still could not believe she was his. "I did not know it could feel like this," Chelsea whispered. "Like what?" "Safe." Chelsea closed her eyes, loved, happy, all at once. Dalton kissed her forehead. "You deserve all of it. Deserve all of every bit." They made love slowly, tenderly, with a gentleness that Chelsea had never known was possible. There was no fear, no pain, no anxiety about what would happen next. There was only love. When it was over, they lay tangled together in the moonlight. Chelsea's head rested on Dalton's chest. She could hear his heartbeat, steady and strong, like everything else about him. "Chelsea," he murmured. His voice was drowsy with happiness. "Yes, I just wanted to say thank you." Chelsea lifted her head. "For what?" "For taking a chance on me." He smiled. I know it was not easy. I know you had every reason to push me away, but you did not. You let me in. That means everything to me." Chelsea felt tears prick her eyes. Happy tears, the best kind. "You are worth the risk," she said. "You always were." They fell asleep in each other's arms. Outside, the wind whispered through the valley. The creek sang its quiet song. The mountains kept their ancient watch. And in the little ranch house on the Double M, two people who had been broken by life found healing in each other. It was not a fairy tale ending. It was better. It was real. The years that followed were full of hard work and simple joys. Chelsea and Dalton built the Double M into one of the most successful ranches in the valley. They expanded the herd. They improved the land. They hired more hands and treated them fairly. The ranch became known not just for its quality cattle, but for its integrity, for the way its owners did business. Ferguson left town about a year after the wedding. His medical practice had dried up. Too many former patients had decided they wanted a doctor they could trust. He moved back east somewhere. Nobody missed him. Banks lasted a little longer. He tried to rebuild his reputation. He made donations to the church. He sponsored town events. But the stain of what had been revealed at that town hall meeting never fully washed out. Eventually, he sold his leather business and moved to California. He did not say goodbye to anyone. "Karma," Dalton had said. "It takes its time, but it always arrives." Chelsea thought about those words often as she watched her life unfold into something beautiful. Their first child came about 2 years after the wedding. A daughter. They named her Lily Rose, after Chelsea's mother and Dalton's grandmother. She had Chelsea's dark eyes and Dalton's calm temperament. From the moment she was born, she owned their hearts completely. Thomas came 3 years later, a quiet boy with gentle hands who followed his father everywhere. He loved the animals. He loved the land. By the time he was 5, he could identify every plant in Dalton's garden. Little Rose arrived last. Wild and sweet, she believed her father was stronger than the mountains, and her mother was braver than any hero in any storybook. She was probably right on both counts. Watching Dalton with their children made something inside Chelsea bloom even deeper. He was the father she had always wished for herself, patient, kind, present. He sang lullabies in an off-key voice that the children loved anyway. He taught them to plant seeds and wait for them to grow. He lifted them onto horses and walked beside them until they were ready to ride alone. He told bedtime stories that made every shadow feel safe. One evening, Chelsea came in from the barn to find Dalton reading to all 3 children by the fire. Lily Rose was pretending to be too old for stories, but listening anyway. Thomas was asking questions about every page. Little Rose had fallen asleep with her head on her father's knee. Dalton looked up when Chelsea came in. His smile was tired and content. "Long day," he said. Chelsea nodded. "But a good one." She sat down beside him. Little Rose stirred and snuggled closer to her father without waking up. "I never imagined this," Dalton said quietly. "A life this good, children this wonderful, a wife who is still the strongest woman I have ever known." Chelsea took his hand. "I never imagined it either," she admitted. "I thought happiness was for other people. People who had not been hurt. People who had not made the mistakes I made." Dalton shook his head. "You never made any mistakes. You survived. That is not the same thing." Chelsea leaned her head against his shoulder. "I love you," she said. "I love you too." The fire crackled. The children breathed soft and steady. Outside, the valley was settling into evening, the mountains purple against the fading sky. It was ordinary. It was perfect. Years passed like water over stones, smooth and steady, shaping everything they touched. Lily Rose grew up and fell in love with a school teacher from the next town over. Chelsea watched her daughter walk down the same aisle where she had married Dalton, wearing the same shade of blue. Thomas took over more and more of the ranch operations. He had his father's patience and his mother's business sense. Chelsea knew the Double M would be in good hands when she and Dalton were ready to rest. Little Rose surprised everyone by becoming a doctor. She said she wanted to help women like her mother. women who had been hurt and needed someone to believe them. Grandchildren came. The ranch house that had once been silent now overflowed with laughter and chaos and love. Every Sunday, the whole family gathered for dinner. 3 generations around a table that Dalton had built with his own hands. One golden afternoon, Chelsea stood on the porch watching her grandchildren chase chickens around the yard. Their laughter rose in the warm air. Behind her, she could hear Dalton in the kitchen, humming while he cooked. He came out a moment later carrying vegetables from the garden that still grew behind what used to be the bunkhouse. His hair was gray now. His face was lined. But his smile was the same as it had been that first day in the dairy barn. "Our grandchildren are going to wear those chickens out," he said. Chelsea laughed. "They wear me out, too." Dalton stood beside her, shoulder to shoulder, the way they had stood for 30 years. "No regrets?" he asked. Chelsea thought about the girl she had been. Scared, hurt, hidden behind walls built from pain and distrust. Then she looked at the woman she had become. Strong, loved, surrounded by family. Home. "Not one," she said. Dalton kissed her forehead. His voice was soft with wonder. "You bloomed, Chelsea. You really bloomed." Chelsea leaned into him. The valley stretched out before them, mountains watching over the land like old friends. The creek singing its sweet song, the same song it had sung when she was a child, when she was a terrified bride, when she was a broken widow, when she was a woman learning to love again. The same song, but now she could finally hear it. She had learned the truth at last. Love was not something you waited for. It was not something that happened to you. It was not a rescue or a fairy tale or a sudden magic that fixed everything. Love was something you built, every day, with the right person beside you, brick by brick, seed by seed, choice by choice. Chelsea McMillan had built a life, a real life, a full life. And it was more beautiful than anything she had ever imagined.